Hey guys, this is Tommy from the Ravens Creek study, and we've been looking at dispensationalism, which is kind of the uh, undertone of the pre-trib rapture. It's the thought before the thought. Um, I've defined the dispensational view, hopefully without too much bias, and I did it accurately. And I've also given a quick word that a lot of the dispensational view is built upon assertions. But this is true for everyone. I mean, for when you're trying to deal with a grid, a way of viewing the Bible as a whole, it's no longer about proof texts about how to view the Bible. It's we're essentially asking the question of, if you start with Genesis and you go forward, what's the whole of the Bible trying to posit as the way that we would view and understand it? Um, so here with progressive revelation, this is kind of what I want to talk about is in regards to the first tenet, if I remember right. Um, I guess we'll find out. Uh, the question is it true that the revelation in the Bible progresses? Or it is true, but the question is, in what manner does it progress? There is a massive difference between God progressively revealing his purposes and God not foreseeing those end time events. Now, here's what I'm wanting to get at. It's true, the Bible, the revelation progresses. The question is, does it progress in different dispensations in different eras, or is there another way in which it progresses? I guess that's what I'm getting at. Does it truly follow that simply because God doesn't mention the Levitical sacrifices to Adam, Noah, or Abraham, that God relates differently with them than with Israel at Sinai? The various ways in which God interacts with humanity progresses, but what is the reason for that? Is it legitimate to say that God changes the way that he interacts simply because we have entered into a new age? Instead, I think that God is trying to build through history patterns and foreshadowing. The Levitical law reflects the work of Christ on the cross, just like the circumcision of the flesh reflects the heavenly reality known as heart circumcision, which Moses first spoke of, by the way. Here's the thing. The sacrifices in Leviticus 1 through 7 aren't just simply about, well, if you offer these sacrifices, then you're justified. They reflect an eternal sacrifice, which is Jesus. This is the whole argument of Hebrews. When Paul says a Jew is not one outwardly but inwardly, and circumcision not of the flesh but of the heart, what he's getting at is this very point. It's not that the circumcision of the flesh is what matters. It's what the circumcision of the flesh reflects. It's what it represents. There's a heavenly reality known as heart circumcision. And what good is it to be circumcised of the flesh if you haven't been circumcised of the heart? What good is it? So God made a pact with the man and the woman that there would be a man born out of Eve to crush the head of the serpent. Eve then blesses God for the birth of Cain. Why? Maybe this could be the deliverer to crush the head of the serpent. Maybe that's who Cain might be. Instead, Cain kills Abel and thus ruins any hope of messianic expectancy. This is why Seth is so important at the end of Genesis chapter 4. From Seth comes Noah, who is the only man in his family to survive the flood. From Genesis 9:16, we find the establishment of an everlasting or an eternal covenant. From Noah's blessing his two sons, Ham and Canaan is cursed, we find that Japheth and Ham shall enter into Shem's tent. That's a significant thing. From Shem comes Abram, fulfilling Noah's prophecy in Genesis 12:2 and 3. God calls Abram out of all nations to establish him as God's nation. It shall be through his seed that all the families of the earth will be blessed. I'm going through this kind of fast. Hopefully you guys are able to follow along, though. Through election, God chose Isaac over Ishmael, Jacob over Esau. We find out of, we even find out of Jacob's blessing his sons that prophetic utterance is given. The scepter shall not depart out of Judah. And Ephraim was even called to be a Malo Goyim. That's the Hebrew. In Genesis 48:19, it's Malo Goyim, which is translated a fullness of Gentiles. we can then trace the promise of this messianic figure unto King David. You shall have someone on the throne forever, and he shall be my son. It's a paraphrase summary of 2 Samuel 7:12 through 15. So we see this progression in the eternal covenant. There's a progressive revelation. All right. Wow. Why didn't God tell Adam and Eve about this Davidic king who would rule over the nations from Jerusalem? I mean, it seems like if God was planning eternally for him to have a Davidic king who would rule over the nations from Jerusalem, then wouldn't he tell Adam and Eve? Could it be that David in Jerusalem didn't exist at that time? I mean, this is kind of, this should be really basic, right? Why is it that God relates differently with humanity? Is it because of these different dispensations and these different eras, or is it because humanity is constrained within time and it takes time for things to progress? I mean, yes, it is true that God's covenant with Adam and Eve did not require circumcision. Yes, it is true that God's covenant with Abraham did not require the Levitical law. Yes, it is true that the Mosaic law does not span the breadth of the new covenant. The question to ask is, why? Why not? The truth is that they do speak of the same kind of dealings with God. Here's where I can get in trouble. It is through the new covenant looking back that we recognize God's intention from even the beginning. The reason that God deals differently with different people is not because God has changed, nor because these are different dispensations, but because history and time itself is the mechanism that God uses to prepare a people, and eventually the whole world, for the inception of the Messiah and the restoration of all things. There has to be an unfolding of certain events, and along with the unfolding of those events, God is giving a little here, a little there. It is and has always been that righteousness comes by faith and not by works. Grace is not a new thing. Even Noah was delivered because he found grace in the eyes of the Lord. What was hidden in times past was not law versus grace, but that faith and works go hand in hand. Was it before or after the covenant that God called Abraham righteous? It was not after the covenant of Genesis 17. It was before. Grace is given on account of faith, and also on account of faith we are accredited as righteous. This is Salvation 101. You know what I mean? I don't know why this is even a debate here. We cannot say that God has changed through these dispensations the way that he deals with humanity. For example, what about Hebrews 13:8, that he is the same yesterday, today, and forever? Is this why? This is why there has always been a righteous remnant and not the full house of Israel to receive the grace of God. What do I mean by that? There's a 7,000 who have not bowed the knee to Baal. They've been preserved. But those who are not part of that righteous remnant are carried away into judgment. God's covenant was not made solely with the remnant, though, and that's the thing. Here's where it is that I disagree with replacement theology. Yeah, it is about the righteous remnant, and God does send judgment upon those who are not a part of that righteous remnant. But God's covenant was made with the whole house of Israel, and because it was made with the whole house of Israel, therefore, because it was made with the whole house of Israel, Israel is still under that covenant. Just because they're not living up to it doesn't mean that they're somehow excluded. And I'm going to get into all of this that I'm saying a lot deeper, a lot deeper. We're gonna hit this multiple times from multiple different angles. Okay, so don't freak out if I'm losing you here. In the progressive revelation, we find that God has intended from the beginning to redeem all of humanity. How that takes place, and we find that because Genesis 3:15 was not given to Abel or to Seth. Genesis 3:15 was given to Adam. All of the descendants of Adam and Eve are the ones who are supposed to have that deliverer crush the serpent's head and they go back into the Edenic state. How that takes place will then fall into the categories of election, covenant, salvation, and eschatology. But let us not cast aside the first question in order to jump to the other questions. It's not like we should just then say, okay, well then let's go ahead and define election, covenant, salvation, and eschatology. Let's first consider how is it that God plans on redeeming all of humanity. And then from that, we can then determine better as to what election, covenant, salvation, and eschatology would be. Do you understand what I'm saying here? These secondary questions are to be understood in the context of the first. How has God purposed that he would redeem all of humanity? How has God purposed that he would bring about deliverance from Satan's oppression without the destroying of the world, save a remnant, as he did with the flood? The answer to that is that God has chosen a remnant, and that through that remnant, he will usher in this eternal, he will usher in this eternal blessedness. Okay, I missed my H. God has chosen a remnant, and through that remnant, he will usher in this eternal blessedness. The question of dispensationalism and covenant theology, which are the dreaded opponents, covenant theology holding and adhering to replacement theology. The question between the two is whether it is through Israel or through the church, or a third option, through Jesus, which the fourth option would be both. Is it through Israel or is it through the church that this comes? Now, for those who have fulfillment theology and say it's through Jesus, that then would pinpoint that you and I, even if we're in Jesus, are not a part of God's covenant, because it's only Jesus, right? Jesus is the only seed. You can't just say Jesus is the only seed. You and I are the seed of Abraham if we have faith. So obviously what Paul is saying there in Galatians 3:16 is not that Jesus is the one and only seed. So anyway, that's the question. So with that, I'm going to conclude, and we're going to next look at the question of what is Israel. That gets into the aspect of election, and it'll also help to unveil a bit as to what it is that I'm trying to posit here, as to who this question here, the question of dispensational covenant theology is whether it is through Israel or the church that the remnant shall usher in the eternal blessedness. Is it through Israel, or is it through the church, or is it through both? That's what we're going to get at with what is Israel. Thanks for listening. Until next time, I do hope all authenticity and blessedness to you, grace to you in Christ.